Hey everyone, it's Andrew Nagel with Valk9 Designs back again with the next part of the start to finish complex design. We're going to be showing you how I work the textile details on the right side of this pendant. These details will also function as the beginnings of the settings for the Super 7 cabochon and the opal that we're setting in the top of this piece. I am doing a rainbow set of gemstones in this channel setting. You could utilize whatever stones you have on hand, maybe all amethyst or all garnet, whatever you've got. As I said, these are rainbow, they're all sapphires, they're various different colored sapphires. I'll also be doing a morganite at the top of this channel setting. I'm utilizing 2.5 millimeter stones for this. You could do 3 millimeter stones or 2 millimeter stones or even 4 millimeter stones. I'm going to be using 4 sections of 21 gauge square wire to be building this channel setting. And so we're getting out our sections of square wire now. I'm also going to be utilizing 30 gauge wire to bring this all together, 30 gauge round dead soft. I'm going to start by attaching that 30 gauge to one of the square wires for my channel setting. I'm then going to align the rest of the wires next to that one. I'm going to start by bringing that 30 gauge up and over and just around all of those wires to make sure they're nice and secure together. If you haven't seen my bar channel or channel setting tutorial, you should definitely check that out before attempting this video. It is kind of an older video. I should redo that at some point, and but yeah, this is the same process as well. And so we're going to bend down the middle 2 wires at a 90 degree to open up that space between the outer 2, and then we're also going to open up the space between those middle 2 wires and then bend them to run parallel with the top 2 wires, thus forming a little square here. This is making the little cage for the gemstones that we're going to be setting in there. I'm then going to be utilizing a cross weave pattern running from the bottom right to the upper left, and then from the upper left to the bottom left, from the bottom left to the upper right, and then upper right to the bottom right, making an X pattern, crisscrossing that wire, making that X weave to create stability here between those 4 wires before we start to bend them to make the bend in the beginning of this channel setting that we have at the start of this design. Sometimes these wires can be flimsy when working with them, so I like to do a couple of cross weaves just to make sure they're nice and secure before we try to set any gemstones in there. I'm just aligning it up with the design just to make sure that it's at the angles that I need. Once I've made sure everything is aligned, I'm going to go ahead and run my outer 2 wires to bend with the same bend that we did for the inner 2 wires, thus creating, a nice little divot there for the Super 7 cabochon to sit in as it sits on the frame. You can see all the wires bend the same direction and are running parallel with each other. Going to do just a couple more of those cross weaves to make sure this all comes together and is nice and stable. Once you've ran a cross weave pattern on the bottom 2 wires running the same length as your gemstone, that makes a little platform for your gemstone to sit on, you're now ready to start setting some stones in there. We're going to bring up the 30 gauge from the bottom right to the top right. Normally in the bar channel I would do another X pattern, but this style of bar channel setting is it's very interesting. It displays the stones really nice. So we're going to go from the bottom wire, the bottom right to the top right, connect the top right 2 times with the 30 gauge, and then go back down to the bottom right, create an X weave over to the bottom left, and then bring that 30 gauge back up to the top left, twice around to the top left, and then back down to the bottom left. You're basically making those connections, running those little X weaves that you're making as little walls next to the gemstone. That ends up holding it in place, as well as the 21G square sitting on either side of the gemstone face of the table of the stone. You're then going to do the same thing after you've made another little platform for the next stone. You're going to set that stone in that platform and then run that 30 gauge from the bottom up to the top and connect both sides. You're going to continue on as you set all of your gemstones. I again did a rainbow set of gemstones, and so that was 7 stones total, and then I'm also going to be adding another one at the top of this at the top of the channel setting, so that'll be 8 total. As you can see, it creates like no space between the stones when you set it this way. If you do the X weave between each stone, it creates a nice like line between the stones, but if you set them this way, then it allows you to set the gemstones kind of touching each other and much closer. It just looks a bit nicer, depending on what style, what look you're going for. I just thought, all of the stones kind of running flush together would be a nice touch for this rainbow channel setting. And so again, setting that stone in there, utilizing the 30 gauge, we're bringing the 30 gauge from the bottom right to the top right in an X weave fashion, connecting the 30 gauge twice around the top right wire, and then going back down to the bottom right, connecting that 30 gauge between the bottom 2 wires over to the bottom left, and then from the bottom left up to the top left wire, and then from the top left back down to the bottom left. And then we're going to create another platform for the final stone. As you saw me do there, we're going to weave it across, making an X weave pattern and making a platform for that stone to sit on, and then we're going to connect that wire from the bottom right to the top right, twice around the top right, back down to the bottom right, over to the left, to the top left, to the bottom left again, thus setting the stone in there. And then I'm just going to continue doing that X weave pattern until I've made enough of a space that I'm at the top of the channel setting where the Super 7 will sit. And so I'm going to start aligning my wires to run along the top of that stone, utilizing that 30 gauge to bind everything together and making sure that it actually fits around that stone, which it does pretty nicely. I need to bend those top wires a little bit more to make it flush against the stone, but it's looking pretty good so far. And so now we're also going to be setting the morganite into the top of this channel up here, utilizing that 30 gauge again to set that stone in there, creating another platform, another X-weave platform for this stone, and then we're going to set it in a similar fashion, but I'm going to also utilize an X-weave pattern to just kind of finalize this channel setting here. I like it to be very stable, on both ends and at all connection points. So when you're setting those stones in there, make sure you're, not pulling so tight that you break the wire, but applying a little bit of pressure as you're wrapping it around those wires, so that way you're creating a nice tight connection between the top and the bottom base wires of that channel setting, so that way your stones don't move anywhere. I had a couple of issues with the red and orange stones when I started this channel setting that I had to fix off screen, but I was able to fix those and get them back into place and then tighten everything up so that way they don't shift anymore. The channel settings are very secure so long as you get a good, X-weave going before and after them. You just got to get everything nice and secure and stable in there, so that way no stones fall out and you don't have to do repairs down the road. So now that we have finished off our channel setting there by following along with that X-weave pattern just a little bit longer past that morganite, I'm ready to connect this to my frame. I'm going to utilize the outermost square wire to bend it down and connect it to my frame around one of the supports. I'm going to clip off my excess and wrap it twice around that support. Three times. And really make sure it's nice and snug in there. Going to check to make sure that stone fits in there. Looking pretty good so far. And now that it's on the frame, we can start to bend the top of those wires to run them where we need to along the opal. I thought I was recording this whole thing, but it turns out that I wasn't. I had a little bit of a technical difficulty there. But yeah, so I ended up bending the bottom 3 base wires to just run along the bottom support, kind of along the center axis of the whole piece. And then I bent the top 21 gauge wires up and had them run along the side of the opal setting, and I also utilized one of the bottom wires to connect the top part of the channel setting to the frame as well. Gonna make sure that stone fits in there again, and it fits in that bend very nicely. And then now we're ready to start construction on the coil that runs along the channel setting, finishing off the details on this side. We're also going to do some lines that run in between the coil and the channel setting and along the outside of the coil as well. So I'm measuring out my base wire. I'm going to utilize 21G square as the base wire for this coil. I like using square instead of round wire for my coils, so that way when you wrap a round wire around a square, it wraps a bit more snugly than when you wrap around. Say that 10 times fast, a round wire around a round wire. But yeah, so I use the square as my base wire, and then I'm going to be utilizing 24G round as the next base wire of the coil. And so that's going to be the next thicker gauge wire, or the next thinner gauge wire, I suppose, that we're going to be utilizing as kind of the first coil that we're going to wrap around the 21 gauge base to make the larger coil. So this is technically called a double coil. Some people will call it just a coil, but it is technically a double coil, because what you're going to start doing is wrapping the 30 gauge around the 24 gauge, as I'm doing here, to make a single coil, and then you're going to wrap that coil around the 21 gauge base to make a double coil. And so once you've got your 30 gauge attached to your 24 gauge in about an inch or so, you're ready to secure that to your 21 gauge base and just make sure that's nice and snug on there. And now, if you've watched my other coil tutorials, you're familiar with my hand twist method of building a coil, which is where you pinch the 30 gauge between your fingers and then you utilize the base wire as kind of a lever to thread that 30 gauge onto the 24 gauge. But since this is a longer coil, what I'm going to be utilizing is a hand drill. I don't do this often, but for the longer coils, it's just much simpler, and this was a really long coil to try and do. And so I just secure that first little kind of knot where everything comes together onto the base wire, and then using the same method of pinching that 30 gauge between my fingers, not too hard, just lightly enough to guide it. I then lightly spin the drill to feed the 30 gauge onto the 24 gauge wire, and then I will twist all of that onto the 21 gauge base square wire. It was kind of fighting me, and while I was using a coil, this took a little bit longer than I was thinking it would. Starting to twist that coil onto the base wire to start building that double coil, and then setting that double coil back into the drill to continue this coil. Periodically, you're going to have to spin that first coil onto the base wire to start building your double coil.
3 hours later.
Finally got that coil finished up. Now to finish this off, just making sure that it actually runs the same length as this channel setting, I'm going to pull that 24 gauge and finish tying it off around the 21 gauge square, and then clip off the extra once I'm at the end of this line. Then I'm also going to rerun this 30 gauge down the entire spiral of the coil. It creates a nice lined definition between the smaller coil that sits on the 21 gauge base square wire. Now that's the finished coil. We're going to feed that through the frame and connect it to the bottom of the frame. Going to wrap that a couple of times around the frame. Then I'm going to continue bending this coil along the channel setting. Going to finish bending it around the top part as well. And I just want it to run along that channel setting to finish off this detail. So the coil ended up being a little bit longer than the actual channel, and so I'm going to cut that back a little bit, and then we'll be right back. And so I've cut that down a little bit. I just unwound everything and then, trimmed it all back and reconnected it back to the base wire. Now I'm going to feed the rest of that 21 gauge square down and then to the frame and reconnect it, thus securing that to this side of the detail. And then now we're going to start creating some lines that run between the coil and the channel setting and create just another layer of detail on this textile setting. So I'm going to feed one length of 21 gauge square through this hole that I found between the coil and the channel setting, and now I'm connecting that up to my frame. I'm then going to bend the bottom of the innermost wire of the channel setting that was left over. I'm going to bend that kind of running almost 90 degrees to that coil. I think I'm going to bend it back up and run it along the 21 gauge that I just added to this frame, thus creating a bit more of a detail there and connecting those together. Utilizing that 30 gauge, just creating more of an X-weave between that innermost and these outermost wires. There was a nice natural opening between them, so I thought I would just kind of fill that space with an X-weave here. I'm then going to run that innermost wire along the same length as that wire that we've just added. I'm then going to utilize the 30 gauge that we were using for that X weave. Once I organize some of my extra wires here, going to utilize that 30 gauge to then connect those two wires together. So taking that 30 gauge, I'm then going to start wrapping it around that wire that we've bent over from the channel setting, and then a couple of times I'm going to wrap it around both of the wires and then create a little X weave between both of them, and then wrap it again around both just to create a little textured detail there. And then I'm going to continue along the bottom part of the 21 gauge that is running on the outermost part here, the one that we have bent over from the channel setting. And so once I get down towards the end where it's almost nearly touching that coil, and I've decided that I'm going to leave this wire kind of running off to the side, and then I'm going to bend it back and connect it to the frame, while I allow the wire that we've added to the frame, I'm going to allow that to run with the channel setting, and I'm going to finish bending that along the channel setting. But I'm going to connect these two wires with a couple of X weaves before I make that connection down to the frame on this outermost wire. So then I'm going to continue bending that innermost wire along the channel setting and bend it up to the top, where I can then connect it with this 30 gauge that I have left over from the channel setting. Just going to weave them together a couple of times. I have a couple of extra plans for those wires, and so those will remain off to the side until we start working with more of the detailing on the left side. Connect them together just a couple of more times utilizing an X weave pattern. Just pushing that wire up from the other side just to make sure it's nice and flush there. I'll make another connection to secure those later once we wrap this all up. Continuing on with this detail, we're going to add another 21 gauge wire. Oh, excuse me, I used a 20 gauge wire for this part. I'm going to feed it through and then connect it to the back of the frame, and I'm going to utilize this to create an outer detail that runs along the coil to add stability to the coil and also just a bit more stability to the whole piece. I'm then going to bend that 21 gauge and run it along the coil, and then I'm going to utilize another one of the wires from the channel setting and bend it with that along the outside of it. I'm going to run it at a 90 degree, and then I'm going to bend that into the I'm going to bend it along with the rest of it once we continue this on. And that final wire I'm just going to bend down and connect it to the frame. So I'm going to utilize the 30 gauge, running it on the outermost wire that we have left over from the channel setting, and I'm going to wrap that 30 gauge between those three wires, connect it to the middle wire, connect it to the outer wire, back to the middle, back to the outermost, back to the middle, back to inner. I'm just weaving it as an X pattern between all of them, connecting them together, making sure they're nice and stable, creating a little bit of a fan weave here between that bottommost wire, the outermost wire that we're now going to connect to the frame, and then also that center wire. These are the two wires left over from the channel setting. We're connecting that outermost wire to the frame now. And then I'm going to continue along with the 30 gauge wire, and I'm going to weave that along that innermost wire. This is the only wire left over from the channel setting that I'm utilizing. So I'm utilizing 30 gauge to wrap around that 21 gauge and connect it to the 20 gauge that we have added to this frame. We're going to continue running the 30 gauge along the 21 gauge. I'm only going to connect it up to the 21 gauge a couple of times here. I'm mainly wanting to create a thicker line on the 21 gauge, and then I'm going to use an X-weave pattern to connect it up to the 21 gauge, or excuse me, up to the 20 gauge and then back down to the 21 gauge, and then, you know, just a couple of connections like that, and then I'm going to continue running this 30 gauge along the 21 gauge until we get to the end of the coil where you see I've made that bend. Once we're at the end where I've made that bend, I'm just going to connect that bend down to the frame now. And so before I connect it to the frame, I'm going to utilize the 30 gauge to connect the 20 gauge to the 21 gauge again and create another weave pattern right before I end up bending this 20 gauge to run along the coil, and then I'm going to connect the 21 gauge to the frame. So utilizing the end of this 21 gauge wire to round off that 30 gauge, and so that way I can end that weave there and just wrap it up and connect it there. Since we're doing a back plate on this piece, I'm not going to utilize a lot of detailing on the rest of this wire, and so I'm just going to run it up the rest of the coil, the 20 gauge that is. I'm going to run it along the rest of the coil and connect it to the top of the frame because it'll most likely be covered by the bezel that we end up setting this whole piece in. And so continuing with that 20 gauge, running it along the coil, I'm going to also bend that length of 21 gauge that we have left down. Going to weave those together, and then I'm going to run that 30 gauge down that 21 gauge a little bit more until I have enough of a length to wrap that all around the frame. Clip off your extras, and then I'm going to connect that to the frame. Once you have that connected to the frame, you're ready to connect the top line to the frame as well. So what I've done is I've just ran that 20 gauge along the coil and connected it back to the frame near the top. And so I'm also going to connect the coil and the channel to the frame at another connection here, utilizing some 22 gauge half round. I've fed the 22 gauge half round through a little open spot between the morganite at the top and then the rainbow channel of sapphires. I've fed it twice through that opening, and I've connected it to the frame, and then I'm going to feed this 22 gauge half round wire back through the bottom of the frame, and then between the coil and around the 21 gauge square wire that we have running in between the coil and the channel setting. I'm going to wrap it twice around that square wire, and then I'm going to feed it back through the opening between the coil and the channel, and then I'm going to connect that back to the frame as well. So that's going to create a nice stable connection for those two elements of the piece. Finalizing any connections and making sure it's all nice and secure. we're looking pretty good for this side of the pendant. And yeah, we're going to leave those 21 gauge wires sticking off the top. I'll be connecting them to some of the details that are coming from the left side of the pendant. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you for watching, and thank you all so much for the support here. I truly appreciate it. This one has been kind of a wild one to work with and put together, so I'm sorry if it was kind of clunky and awkward. It was just a lot of content to like cut down and to talk over and stuff. So thank you all so much. I appreciate it, and I hope you have an incredible weekend.